Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dad Hab Live. I am your host, Joe Messeri, and I am really excited about our show today. We have a great guest with us, Jessica Lahey. She writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, just a couple of rags you might have heard about. And she is the author of a new book, The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much.
So I have to say, I feel like that this book is so important and timely. I think that right now, especially coming out of a pandemic where people are dealing with so many mental health issues and living in a society where we try and mask those pains and dull our emotions and fears, that we're seeing this not just among adults, but among kids as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what made you write this book and the timing of it.
So this book is, I'm really proud of my first book, The Gift of Failure. I'm always, I'll always love that book. But this book was really the book that all of my life experiences sort of led me to, mainly because I was raised in a home with an alcoholic, and no matter how hard I tried to sort of avoid it, I slid into it in my 40s. And, I thought I had my defenses up. I thought I was doing all the right things. And I got in over my head, so to speak, in my 40s. And then once I got sober in 2013, almost immediately my attention and all that attention and anxiety and all that energy I was putting into my drinking and suddenly shifted to my kids and trying to figure out how, okay, if I was raised in a house with an alcoholic and my parent was raised in a house with an alcoholic and so on and so on and so on, how do we stop this? How do we get a hold of this, but moving forward? And my husband was also raised in a family where there's a fair amount of substance abuse. So we knew, genetic legacy, we couldn't ignore this. It was, ignored at our peril. And at the same time, once I had about a year of recovery under my belt, I started working with kids in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents. I was their teacher. So, I capped off 20 years, at that point, 15 years of teaching with 5 years in this drug and alcohol rehab for kids. So now I'm curious, what does it mean when the experts say that substance abuse is preventable? What does that mean for my kids who already have a genetic predisposition? And what does it mean for my students? I mean, in terms of not only their kids, but what could we have done to have what works in order to prevent getting them to that point? What could we have done? What didn't we do? What did we do? All that sort of stuff. So I just wanted to understand what, the idea that it's preventable means on a very practical level. So I got to I have the most fun job ever. I got to do a deep dive into the research, and I'm such a big dork. I love the research. I'm married to a statistician, so he loves helping out. And translate that research into something that people will want to read.
That's a great partnership right there. And we were talking before we came on air a little bit about the way you balance the science with the anecdotal stories in this. And I think you do a fantastic job of that, because getting into the science can get a little bit heavy, but you make it so useful in your book. And I really appreciate that. We're going to get into some of those tips and tricks that you give a little bit later. But I want to talk about your experience, and specifically, you use the term the elephant in the room a lot. You talk about shame and secrecy surrounding substance abuse. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like growing up and not being able to address it? Because I don't think this is exclusive to substance abuse. I think sometimes in families, you have this idea of we don't talk about our negative traits that exist in this family, regardless of what they are. I mean, I grew up in an Italian family where it stays in the house, it stays at the table, right? And we still do that, and we would lift everybody up when we're outside the house. But how do you balance that, right, in addressing those issues internally so that something gets done and they don't fester?
So that the metaphor about the elephant in the room actually came from Susan Cheever, who wrote a beautiful book about her father, the writer John Cheever, who was a really just raging alcoholic. And she talks a lot about, the fact that it's so damaging that there's this ginormous elephant in the middle of the room and no one is allowed to acknowledge that it's there. We have to walk around it. We have to pretend it's something else, anything other than an elephant. And that's the situation I was in. My sister and I were we did a tag team kind of, okay, I'll bring it up this time. No, you bring it up this time kind of thing. And yet we still weren't allowed to talk about it. And it wasn't until we were adults, actually, that we finally were able to sort of nail it down and say, no, this is what's going on in our family. And that secrecy, that shame, that guilt is, I think sort of what got me to a place where I was so isolated in my drinking. I was so scared, so anxiety ridden about losing everything. And the secret just got so big that, when my dad actually finally intervened on me and said, his exact words were, "I know what an alcoholic looks like, and you're an alcoholic." And the relief of getting that, someone just pointing at that elephant and saying,
Right.
look, that's an elephant, was, no matter how scary it was for me, it was also just such a relief.
Yeah, that was a poignant moment from reading this book when he actually sat you down and talked about it. I also thought it was interesting the way you talked about getting into that alcoholism, and you said my drinking increased slowly, so I didn't notice it was happening. And at the Dad Habit, one of the things we talk about, right, is good or bad, these little habits build on each other, and they do multiply. So small wins can lead to bigger wins. Small losses can lead to greater losses. Can you talk about how it kind of started for you? Because I know day one is very important, as we talk about in your book, and how you kind of came to that realization of, okay, how did I get to this place?
See, and what's so interesting is I've always thought of my story as being really different from a lot of the stories that I hear in recovery. For a lot of people, they have that first drink when they're usually somewhere between 12 and 14 and say, oh, that's the thing that's been missing, or that's the thing that I can, that's going to help me feel better about myself or my anxiety or whatever it is. And it really wasn't like that for me. I didn't really start drinking in earnest until I was in my 40s. And I think it was partially, it just became a habit for me and it became an emotional crutch. I also do suffer from anxiety. And we know for a fact that women who suffer from anxiety are really high risk for substance abuse. And in fact, the statistics show that women who have anxiety disorder are more likely to drink abnormally than to drink normally. So, I was squarely in that risk group, but I can't really point to a moment in which I said, when it started to pick up, it just did. It was almost like it had a life of its own and I just didn't see it. No matter how high I really did think I was quite vigilant. And I had a few false starts at sobriety. I would do like 6 months here, 6 months there. I stopped
Right.
for a year once. I definitely stopped during my pregnancies. But it wasn't until I named it what it was, until I pointed at it and said, no, this is a real problem. And this has to be addressed through some sort of recovery. And, for me, it was 12-step. That doesn't work for everyone, but definitely was a miracle for me.
Right. And you mentioned the anxiety that women deal with, and you also point out in your book that women are twice as likely to have anxiety disorders as men. And, I think
Yeah.
right now when we hear about so many people staying at home, whether it's mothers or fathers, adults just in general, hearing about people drinking more wine, drinking more alcohol in their house, during this pandemic, because that social aspect, which might slow you down, is gone. At least there's a meal involved in it. It really is, I feel like, a numbing effect that people need because they have so many other things missing from their lives. And I think they're kind of using alcohol to try and fill that void, or other substances. And in a way, they're also just numbing those things.
I'm coming out of this pandemic 10 pounds heavier than I went in. So I can't for a second say that I didn't compensate in some way during this, but I'm also so grateful that I was not drinking during this. There have been a couple of periods that have been really tough. I had a head injury a bunch of years ago, and all the depression and stuff that was associated with that concussion syndrome afterwards. And thank goodness I wasn't drinking during that period.
Yeah.
Drinking during this pandemic would have gotten ugly fast if I was even still around to experience it. It's a very clear way in the short term to deal with our anxiety and our depression. But the problem is that it makes anxiety worse, and it definitely makes depression worse. And so, our view that it does fix things in the short term tends to override the fact that, our realization that over the long term, it's making things much, much worse.
Yeah. I want to talk about our attitudes toward alcohol for a second, because I think that so many times, I grew up in a household where we talked about the European model and the way that Europeans treat alcohol. But your book talks about the problems that go along with that, especially when it comes to introducing to kids at such a young age. And you were talking about 12, 14 years old in adolescence when these people start to experience their first taste of alcohol.
Yeah, it's shocking to me. It's amazing to me how many, it's not shocking. It's amazing to me how many parents email me and say, I just can't believe it. I found alcohol in my 12-year-old's backpack. And that, and they're like, oh my gosh, she's so young. I can't believe it. And, that's exactly when experimentation starts. And 90% of people who have a substance use disorder during their lifetime say that they started before they were 18. And the reason that it's so important for kids to delay first use as long as possible sort of goes in two directions. One is that we're not talking about adult brains here. We're talking about adolescent brains. And adolescent brains are going through the second of the two most massive, sensitive periods of growth and reconstruction in our lives. For the first is 0 to 2, and then adolescence, puberty until early 20s. The more we can protect the brain and keep substances out of the brain until, that don't mess with the, very sensitive attempts of the brain to sort of normalize the neurotransmitters and all the chemicals in our brains, the better off kids are. There's all kinds of research to show what short-term and long-term damage substances like drugs and alcohol can have in the adolescent brain. Again, we're not talking about the adult brain. Substances have, can have a very low or no harm in an adult brain, but can have significant harm in an adolescent brain. The second half is with each year that we delay on, first use, we protect our kids statistically from having substance use disorder during their lifetime. So, if kids start in middle school, they're somewhere around a little bit over 50% chance of having substance use disorder during their lifetime. But if we can get them just to 12th grade, it goes way, way down, like to 10%, which is what it is in the general population. So, ideally 21. And then the interesting thing about that European model you mentioned is that, number one, it's a myth. I totally bought into it with my older kids. So I'm guilty of this too. That if we give kids sips, we can teach them how to drink in moderation. And that just doesn't work. Not only statistically in terms of who ends up with substance use disorder during their lifetime, but also because Europe, according to the World Health Organization, Europe and especially Eastern Europe has the highest levels of alcohol consumption in the entire world. So that moderation model is hogwash. And, I get sucked into that too. And I totally get the whole, kids are going to drink anyway. And so I'm going to take the keys away and buy the keg and let them drink in the basement and at least they'll be safe. But what you're doing is is actually increasing your kids' risk of having substance use disorder during their lifetime. Any sort of permissive messaging about drinking, even if it's that, well, they're going to do it anyway, which, by the way, is not true. The numbers of kids who drink before they're 18 is lower than you might expect. So, the longer we have a consistent message of no, not until 21 or until it's legal or whatever it is you want it to be, 18, 21, the longer we can keep them from having that first drink, the better off they will be from a cognitive perspective and from a risk perspective.
And I won't get too much into the science here, but you talk about the brain still developing in the frontal cortex until they're 25 years old, and that kind of leading to it. And you're right, it is so important that we talk about that as a development stage, because those first 3 years, that's all we hear about as parents, and how important those first 3 years are. And
if you think about the fact that the World Health Organization's also said there's no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy, and yet they're going through the brain is developing sort of at the same level of sensitivity as it would be during, as a fetus or as a 0 to 2 year old. And so you can imagine that all kinds of negative things can happen. All kinds of terrible things can happen to the adolescent brain in the presence of substances.
And, I appreciate you saying and sharing the fact that you raised your older son on that European model idea. And that's one of the things I love about your book is you are so human, you are so vulnerable and honest. We spoke to someone else, James Robillata, who talks about leadership through your imperfections, because nobody can learn from somebody perfect. And there's a couple examples that you give throughout there. One that hit home to me, where you said something along the lines of, I hope my son realizes that I made some mistakes, that I learned from them, and that he will do the same. And that really hit home for me. I always talk about in our group, in our program, it's great if you can learn from your mistakes. It's even better if you can learn from someone else's mistakes. But that honesty and that vulnerability is just something that I think really resonates throughout your writing here.
It may piss off my 17-year-old a little bit because he's being raised in a different situation. My 22-year-old, I had that sort of permissive thing going on, and then with my 17-year-old, it's a no, not until it's legal kind of thing. And you know, but the nice thing about that is I'm modeling exactly what I want to see from him. I want him to be the kind of person who says, okay, I'm doing the best I can based on the information I have. And if I learn something different and I find out that maybe I haven't been doing the best based on the evidence, that I'll change and admit to my mistakes. And, that's what my whole first book is about, The Gift of Failure. So, yes, it pisses him off. And yes, he tests it every once in a while. He tested us just a few weeks ago, asked for a sip of something, knowing full well we were going to say no. But it's just one of those moments where they poke just to make sure that we really meant it when we said that thing. So
I'm a big fan of Jurassic Park, and one of the things I wrote about was that kids are kind of like velociraptors, and in that movie they talk about how the raptors are testing the fences for weak spots in the electricity. So it's good to know that they're still doing that at 17 years old.
They find it reassuring when they realize that fence is still on. Both toddlers and adolescents alike really do look to us to say, okay, now really is that, okay, cool, that is the limit. Nothing's changed, because that sense of consistency actually is reassuring to kids. As kids become older during adolescence, they do need to pull away from us. They do need more freedom. They do need more novelty. So we have to, grow with them accordingly. But in the meantime, when there's the really important limitations, expectations, and consequences that we set down for them, when they poke, they really need for those expectations and consequences to still be there. I love that velociraptor analogy, though. That's good.
Well, it's just one of my favorite movies. I'm in the dinosaur stage of parenting, so it just resonated very well for my audience here.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to talk about is some of the risk factors that go into this when kids are growing up at that adolescent stage. And then we can get into some of the, protections that can exist. But divorce is one of the ones that you point out there. And I think divorce is becoming more and more common. We have so many single fathers. I was raised by a single mother, although she was separated from my biological father long before I was cognizant of anything that was going on. And I was fortunate to have some very strong male role models in my life. But can you talk about some of those risk factors, including divorce, and how they go to increasing a child's likelihood of substance abuse?
It's funny, you were talking about how, I managed to put the science in such a way that you actually weren't, turned off by it. Here's the other big hurdle. So I have to, both with Gift of Failure and with this book, I have to say a lot of things that but in the evidence, in the data, that are difficult to hear. And, when it comes to Gift of Failure, I have to say things like, it's really important to love the kid you have and not the kid you wish you had. And it's like a gut punch, because, that's a tough one to hear. With this, when I talk about things like, okay, risk factors, and I picture, by the way, like a scales of justice. And if the risk side is really heavy, then the prevention side is going to have to be really heavy too, in order to zero it out so that we can outweigh that risk side. But when I talk about risk factors, people are used to hearing about the big ones, like adverse childhood experiences, big T, trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, a parent that's incarcerated, a parent that dies, violence in your household, that kind of stuff. So starting actually with the biggest one, that's genetics. So genetics makes up about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. And then after that, we have the trauma stuff, the adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as they're called in the research lingo. Right. And then we have things like child-on-child aggression, when children are aggressive towards other kids. That's something we need to pay attention to. Academic failure, undiagnosed learning issues, social ostracism. And then there are not just risks having to do with our specific kid, but also having to do with periods of time, transitions, especially the transition between middle school to high school is a really risky time. But the hard part about hearing that divorce and separation are on there, adoption is on there. If you read Nadine Burke-Harris's brilliant book, The Deepest Well, she expands on the ACEs list quite a bit and adds a whole bunch of childhood experiences that are quite common, but are also risk factors for substance abuse. So if we can hear those things from a place of it's actually empowering, it is information to have that data, as opposed to, oh, now I just feel bad. What could I ever do? I feel guilt. I feel shame. If we could use that information and then target the preventions really well based on what our kids' individual risk factors are, then we stand a much better chance of getting them, getting them through with as little harm as possible. But yeah, it's really tough to mention that, a really, really common occurrence, divorce and separation, is a risk factor for substance abuse. But to not say that is, number one, disingenuous, number two, just not true, and is a whole other elephant that I would just be avoiding naming because
Right.
it's too difficult for people to hear.
And you can't address the problem if you don't talk about it and
Right.
acknowledge that it's there.
Right.
I think
And there's really great programs, and there's really, really great programs that help kids deal with, divorce and separation. And so, I offer those up as a resource as well. So anyway.
And I think that you started that off by saying it's so easy to talk about abuse and neglect and homelessness and all of these bigger issues that seem kind of outside of us. But talking about the issues that everybody deals with, like the divorces, like just the stress that goes on. You said that the most stressed out people are kids 15 to 21. But I think that goes into addressing the not my kid, right? That it can't happen to my kid, and that's not a thing. So how do you open parents' eyes to the fact that, yes, their kid too is vulnerable, and if you acknowledge that earlier, you can address it and maybe prevent it or at least limit the effects that might be coming up?
So there's a couple different ways to sort of help people open their ears to this. Some of them are by writing in the book, I make it really clear in the Not My Kid chapter, I make it really clear that, kids in rehab can look one way, sort of the way you might expect them to look because of the sort of stereotypes. But then there's the kids that look just like your kid, and they're there too. And, one of the most common questions I get over email about gift to failure has to do with girls and anxiety. And girls and anxiety are one of the biggest groups of kids. Girls with anxiety are one of the biggest groups of kids that end up, messing around with alcohol in order to alleviate that anxiety. And so I profiled Georgia in the book. And Georgia, that's her real name, by the way. She was so generous to share her story. And she's doing great now as an adult, but she lost her adolescence to all kinds of drug and alcohol abuse and prison and losing a child and all that sort of stuff. But when I say, when a parent comes to me and says, look, I have a kid who's a perfectionist and has a lot of anxiety, I can't not tell them that, by the way, that's a massive risk factor for substance abuse. And so addressing that anxiety, either through reading certain resources that I have available to them, of other friends of mine who have written beautiful books, like Lisa D'Amour's book, Under Pressure, which is about girls and anxiety, or, getting some help or reevaluating just what's causing them the stress. And if we really need to be, and that's all what Gift to Failure is about, what we really need to be focusing on when we're raising kids, as opposed to, whether or not they're getting A's.
Right. So let's go into some of those protections, because I think we've established this. And you have a lot of protections at all different levels that parents can incorporate into their own children's lives. But there are a couple that I want to touch on because I think they're particularly relevant to our audience. The first one is physical activity. We had on the author of Spark the other day, and I was just talking about the importance of exercise in learning, but as a defense mechanism for avoiding substance abuse. How does that work?
So physical activity is a double-edged sword in the sense that if we lump it into sport, which is why I didn't lump it into sports, because certain sports are actually increase kids' risk of substance abuse. It tends to be the higher contact sports. And being a sports fan, by the way, in college also increases your risk. And that's no coincidence. I mean, the marketing that the alcohol companies do through sports is specifically targeted to get kids in early for brand loyalty. So, but physical activity not only releases all kinds of chemicals in our brains, that runner's high that people talk about. It also, as kids have more physical activity going on in their life, they've got more of the sort of happy chemicals going on. They feel better about themselves. They're getting fresh air. So and they'll tend to, if they're really into it, they'll tend to hang with other kids that value that as well. And so that gets at sort of the peer group angle. And I address that as well in its own chapter in the book. So, and I just did a Facebook Live actually with the people over at a group called I Love to Watch You Play, a sports group. And they, what's really interesting is when it comes to sports and substance abuse, it's a really complicated picture. And it turns out that, the way team captains go are the way the team goes. And so for prevention measures, that's great news to me, because that means that we have a really good idea of where to target our efforts around preventing substance use in kids. So if we can get the team built not just a hard partying mentality, and we can sort of get them thinking about, wellness and stuff like that. So anyway, coaches are really powerful. Team captains are really powerful, all that sort of thing, which actually leads to one other one, which is prevention, which is having great allies. And there are lots of them out there, teachers, coaches, pastors, but people tend to overlook like your kid's pediatrician or a healthcare provider. They do these, a lot of them do these screenings. A really popular one is called SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And if you have ever noticed when your kid goes into their appointment right before, they tap out some answers on a tablet, that's a risk assessment. That helps the physician understand what they might need to talk about with your kid. So please give your kids some space when they're filling that out. This is not a test of your parenting. This is a test of, it's not even a test, it's an assessment of, what your kid is exposed to. And the more privacy your kid has around that, the more honest they're likely to be. And school counselors and school nurses, all of these allies, the research shows that if a kid has one person that they can confide in and that trusts them and that they feel like supports them, that no matter what they've been through as a kid, it radically increases their risk of having physical and mental health as an adult.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We'll come back to some of the protections, but something you just said made me think of it from the book. You talk about giving your kids some space when they're filling out these forms. And in your house rules section, you talk about being that parent who is protective, but also gives them their space because you want to show trust. And if you're overprotective, then it doesn't show that you trust your kids. So how do you balance that? One of the things that opened my eyes was you said you have never checked your child's social media, websites, or email?
Never. I know from my
perspective.
Well, and specifically what I'm talking about is email and texting, because that tends to be the big one that parents check up on. And I'm not holding myself up as some paragon. It's just that in our home, that is symbolic of a lot of things. I've always been a writer, and I feel, and one of my kids in particular keeps a journal, or used to keep a journal. And that is a place for him to write his very private thoughts. And I would never in a million years read that. However, that said, I can't say never in a million years, because that said, that's open to change, not necessarily the reading the journal, but checking in on his browsing history and checking in on texts and emails is open. If suddenly I saw a big change in my kid and I was worried about his health, he wasn't sleeping, or he suddenly wasn't eating, or whatever, his mood changed drastically, that is open to change, and they understand that. But if you think about, I'm 50, I was born in 1970, and reading a kid's text is akin to going up into the guest room in your house and picking up the extra line on the phone and listening in. Or, there's all sorts of other unforeseen consequences. Kids who are more controlled and surveilled by their parents lie to their parents much more. They feel less trusted. They're less likely to rise to expectations around trust. The other thing is, I talked to a parent a while back who her kid was just devastated because she had been cut out of her friend's texting circle for no reason. They didn't talk to her about it. They just cut her out of it. And when we got to the bottom of we figured out what was going on. It was because all of her friends knew that her mother reads her texts, and those kids didn't want their texts to be read. And they also didn't want her to feel bad. So they didn't talk about it. And so this girl gets alienated from her friends because her mother is intruding on her privacy, which includes the privacy of other kids. So and I also don't look at the school portal. I don't log on to the school portal to look at my kids' grades, because school is his responsibility and communication with the teacher is his responsibility. And by the time they get to middle school, it really does need to be moving into the area of their responsibility.
Okay. And I want to talk about that and address that for a second. You said 17 and 22-year-old, that now they have that responsibility of their grades and it's their own. Were you doing it when they were younger?
Yeah. So I've taught every grade from 6 to 12. Okay. And kids from grade 6 to 12, I would fully expect that those kids are the ones talking to me about, I didn't understand this. I didn't have this assignment because of XYZ. I need to talk to you about what I don't understand. That's not the parent's job. And especially if their kid is hesitant about talking to adults. And I've been recommending, and I have to move my computer for a second. One of the books I'm really loving right now actually is Julie Lythcott-Haim's new book, How to Be an Adult, Your Turn, because one of the things she talks about in this really a book aimed at young adults. This is I own 20 copies of it and have been giving them away like crazy, because this is for kids like, young adults 16 to 25. And one of the big things one of the chapters in here is you have to talk to strangers. You have to talk to adults in order to be able to self-advocate and figure out what you need and get people to help you.
Right.
And if we're going to suddenly, at 18, our kid is suddenly in charge of talking to adults, it's going to leave them completely flummoxed, which is why Julie wrote this book. Julie used to be a freshman dean at Stanford. And she said these 18-year-old kids would come into her office with no idea how to problem solve or talk to adults. And so by middle school, you should not be the main conduit of information between home and school. You can be a support, but really you need to be encouraging that from a young age. And kindergarten teachers actually told me that one of the things that they have to work really hard on with kindergartners is teaching them to use their big kid voice, to, talk to the teacher about what's bothering them. And, they said, but when a kid runs up and says, so-and-so was mean to me, the teacher's response should be, have you talked to so-and-so about how that made you feel? Because helping kids learn to self-advocate is one of the most important things we do.
I'm sure that there are some parents or people just listening to this that are kind of pulling their hair out going, well, but you told me their brains aren't developed until they're 25. How can I give them this responsibility? And it really is. I mean, you talked about the scales of justice and balance in there. How do you find that balance that has worked for you as a parent?
It's really hard for me specifically because I wrote an entire book on stepping back and giving your kids more autonomy. And I still wholeheartedly believe in that. If you look at the research on substance abuse and who starts experimenting and when they experiment, it is absolutely true that kids that summer is a high risk period when and this is what just kills me. In one of the books that I cite, they talk about the fact that when teens hang out unsupervised with other teens is a very high risk time, right? Well, what are you going to do? Never let them hang out with other teenagers?
Right.
We have to let them. And my husband likes to say, well, we could say, your kid will never, ever get wet if you don't ever let them go outside in the rain. But that's not feasible. Part of the role of adolescence is to move away from us, to do this process called individuating. And in order to do that, they need to have alone time with their peers. They need to have novelty. They need to engage in behaviors that feel slightly scary to them, because that's a part of becoming an adult. And so if we can help guide them toward positive risk, towards novelty that is useful, as opposed to, because they're trying to, and the important thing about novelty that you need to understand is that adolescents have lower baseline levels of dopamine than young children and adults. And dopamine is at its essence our not just pleasure, it's our drive, it's our sense of, it's that feeling of being alive and feeling like you're engaged in your life and you're motivated. And so when teenagers say to us, oh, I'm so bored, they're not being dramatic. They really do feel bored because of this lower baseline level of dopamine. So they seek out novelty in order to make themselves feel more alive. And that is absolutely 100% appropriate in adolescence. It's what they're supposed to be doing.
So I go back to that mom that you talked about that was on her daughter's friend's text chain there. And for me, it makes me remember there's an episode of Black Mirror. I don't know if you're a fan of the show or have seen it, but the mother is literally seeing everything her daughter is seeing to the point where it causes this whole issue. And, go watch the episode if you want, but it gets very dark as Black Mirror tends to do.
I got about 100 emails about that episode. And I watched in part of the first season of Black Mirror and then was absolutely horrified by one where I think the prime minister has to kill himself on television or something like that. And I couldn't watch after that episode. So I haven't seen the episode, but I've heard all about it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. It gets very dark, but it shows the perils
Yeah.
of overprotective
Yeah.
parenting, right? And
Well, and
the obviously
even the
technology
people,
and how. Go ahead.
even the people who are pro, like there's all these apps now. There's this one like Life 365, which is a horror show,
Yeah.
in my opinion, simply because when I talk to teenagers, what they tell me is if they don't get some room to become their own person, they're gonna take it, and they often take it by deception. They often
Mm.
take it through lying about stupid stuff like, that doesn't even matter. And that line, it's a really fine line. And like I said, if I have a worry, if I have a concern about my kid, I like to use what Lonnie Coombs, who's a former prosecutor and wrote this book called You're Perfect and Other Lies Your Parents Told You. She talks about the plain view doctrine. And as a former, someone who went through law school, I'm totally on board with this, that if you see something that really seems evident, obvious, paraphernalia of drug use, something that really worries you in terms of their mood, rapid changes, even if that rapid change is from depressed to suddenly very happy, as much as you don't want to look that gift horse in the mouth, that's a horse I'm going to be looking really carefully at, because any rapid change in behavior habits with an adolescent, is something I want to kind of pay attention to, because that means that something is going on with my kid, for better or for worse.
Right.
And if it's better, great, that's fodder for great conversations. And if it's for worse, then that's also something we need to be talking about.
When you talk about your previous book and talk about all of the things that you're trying to promote in these kids to make responsible decisions, it's self-efficacy is what it falls under. And you address
Right.
this a ton
Right.
in your book. And I love this. This is something we talk a lot about in our group. We talk about locus of control. And you say,
Right.
start with yourself. Right.
Right.
And we use the example of when you're on an airplane, you got to put on your mask first, or you can't pour from an empty cup, and all those things that I think have become cliche at this point. But can you talk about the importance of starting with yourself? Because I think so many parents struggle with this. We say all the time, there's no handbook for parenting. They're questioning their decisions. They don't get it right all the time, and they know when they mess up. So how do you
Yeah.
tell parents to have confidence in their own decisions and that they can be in control?
Yeah. So this, if anyone's interested and doesn't have the book and wants to go just read this section, it was actually excerpted in the New York Times, so you can go see it there. It's self-efficacy is a feeling of, if I make a decision, if I take action, that it will affect change. And it's linked, for example, to hope. And the late, great Shane Lopez, who worked for Gallup, and his Twitter handle was Hope Monger. This is a guy who studied hope. And he defines hope as the belief that our lives can be better and that we have the power to make it so. And self-efficacy is a really important part of that. It's also the antidote to sort of that learned helplessness that we see in kids a lot, like the, I can't do it, you just do it for me. That sort of learned helplessness. And by the way, we're the ones who teach them that. Learned helplessness, the antidote to that is to give more control back, to give kids more autonomy, to give kids opportunity to have what you referred to, and I love this term, small wins, because especially for kids who are afraid of screwing up, of not looking perfect, that have a lot of anxiety, if those kids won't try the big stuff, then give them get the opportunity to have a lot of small wins, because those small wins can really quickly turn into big wins. And when it comes to self-efficacy, small wins are the name of the game. Like, if we can praise them and help them see their self-efficacy as they're moving along, even if it's just things like, sweetie, 6 months ago, this math was so frustrating for you that you would have given up like that. And tonight I was watching you while you did your homework, and you stuck with that problem that was hard for you for like 20 minutes. I am so proud of you for that. And showing them that they've made progress in the right direction and that they've made progress regarding their effort. That's all really important stuff to help kids feel like they have more self-efficacy.
So I want to just say that I have to give a shout out to my mother here, because the word can't was never allowed in my house.
Yeah.
And she is an educator as
Yeah.
well. And I have passed that down to my children, to the point where I was out in our backyard yesterday and there was a hula hoop playing there. And my son said, "Oh, Dada, show me how to hula hoop." And I said, "I can't." And he says, "Don't say can't." And I said, "Okay, I have a hard time."
Here's
and
an
so
addition.
we're practicing. Yeah.
Here's an addition. Here's a wonderful growth mindset way to think about this. And if you've read Carol Dweck, you know what I'm talking about. But a great way to think about it, a word that's used a lot in schools these days is yet. I can't do it yet. When your kid says, I can't do it, then a great response is, of course you can't do it yet. You just learned.
Right.
When I first started writing, when I first started playing guitar, I couldn't play Layla yet in that first lesson. That was something I had to work towards. And of course you can't hula hoop. You've never picked up a hula hoop before, but let's give it a shot and see if we can get there. That word yet is so powerful.
And then the other thing that you mentioned, which I loved, was the Goldilocks effect for building skills. Look for the skills that are just right for their age group, or maybe just a little outside their
A
grasp.
little above is actually perfect. Just a
Yeah.
little bit. Just stick your toe. And this is for neurotypical and neuroatypical kids alike. Just stick your toe over that line of where you think their ability level lies. Just stick your toe beyond it. And most teachers know that a lot of teachers know there's this tool called desirable difficulties that actually is one of the most powerful teaching tools we have. And it requires us to give kids tasks that are a little bit frustrating for them, a little bit beyond their ability level. It has to do with the way the memory is stored, and it's this thing called encoding. But essentially, kids learn the deepest when they have to work a little bit to figure something out. And especially when they figure it out on their own, they'll have a deeper understanding, and they'll have it more durably over the long term.
Yeah. And I look at it, you say, be optimistic. My nickname in college and at the end of high school and since is Smiley. I'm always smiling, and I say that it's because I had a great family. I'm very lucky in that sense, and it was just mirroring is more than anything else. But the same way I think that good habits and skills can build on one another, optimism and pessimism can as well. Excuse me there.
Yeah.
So what advice do you give people to get started on trying to be optimistic?
This all comes down to framing. And there's actually an article, it was in the Boston Globe, I think, about teaching about, again, starting with yourself, that this is a great place to start, that if you start with yourself, with modeling self-efficacy for your kids, letting them see that you're trying things that are a little bit difficult for you, and you have that emotional and intellectual bravery. But the same thing goes with reframing. So there's a great example of this in the book. One of the big risk times, as I said, for kids is between middle school and high school. And transitions are really risky times for kids when it comes to substance use. So like moving. So we moved our family when my younger kid was in between middle school and high school. We moved him away from his friends, away from the parents of those kids that I trusted with my kid's life. And suddenly we're putting him in this situation and just immersing him in all kinds of risk factors that wouldn't have been there for him if we had just stayed where we were. And I was talking to Dr. Dan Siegel about this, and he was listening very patiently and listening to me talk about it. And he said, Jess, you could think about all of this as risk and be scared of it, or you could reframe it as precisely what your son needs right now, which is some novelty, some opportunities to exercise and explore some positive risk. And in that moment, he just went whoop and shifted my perception of this thing from a place of, I am so horrible for what I've done to my kid. We are bad parents. I've immersed him in all this risk and all this darkness. And of course, that was affecting the way I was talking about it with my kid, no matter
Right.
how optimistic I wanted to seem about it. And then all of a sudden, Dan Siegel has me reframing, and I'm looking for new opportunities to sort of put him out there in the world and say, have at it, dude. This is great for you, because all this novelty is feeding what his adolescent brain needs most, that novelty, that slight risk that goes along with novelty. It was a great opportunity for me to see just how powerful my framing is when it comes to how I model that for him.
And I know you went to Vermont there and you mentioned in the book some of the hikes that you've gone on with your son. Dr. John J. Rady, who wrote Spark that we talked about, talks about the importance of being outdoors and getting that exercise to open your mind. I think that transitions nicely to mindfulness, right? Because so many times when you're in nature, you get to process those thoughts. And it's another big thing that we try and stress with our parents, because, oh my God, when you're just trying to get out the door in the morning, sometimes you're thinking about a million things. Let's just go. It's hard to slow down. It's hard to be in the moment. What are the impacts that you have seen with mindfulness when it comes to preventing substance abuse?
There's on TikTok right now, there's a bunch of videos going around of these. There's this one of this little boy. He's probably like I don't know, like 6, and his little toddler sibling is sort of freaking out, and the 6-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old boy is
I love that.
instructing his toddler sibling to breathe.
Yep.
And it is so powerful. I mean, there's all kinds of woo-woo stuff that goes around, like, okay, in order to have mindfulness, I've got to do formal meditation. And yeah, I tried that in the book, and it was interesting. But what it led to was it was just one version of what mindfulness can be. And so
Mm.
for for my kid, walks in the woods have been really important to him. And for one year for Christmas, his grandparents gave him a hatchet, and he goes out in the woods and will spend inordinate, it looks like a beaver has attacked parts of our woods, because he'll spend an inordinate amount of time just working out his anxiety and frustration over whatever it is by hatcheting down a tree, and then he drags it down. You can tell which pieces of firewood were the hatcheted ones, because it really does look like a beaver, took down a bunch of trees.
As long as they're not falling on the house.
No, they're not falling on the house.
We're
They're
good.
smaller trees. But, what's really interesting is that, when we expose our kids to different kinds of mindfulness, whether that's, time outside in the woods, whether that's, the formal kind, we tried Dan Siegel's Wheel of Awareness stuff. I made a deal with him. I said, try this with me for 30 days. We didn't even make it to 30 days. It became a part of my thinking.
Mm.
But he went on to find a different version of mindfulness and meditation that works for him. And he actually has a little meditation space in his room now. And for him, meditation has become a private thing. He doesn't want to share that with me. And that's cool. As far as I'm concerned, if it's become a part of his thinking. And Dan Siegel does a really great job in his book, Aware, and in his book, Mindset, especially with this one story of this one kid, Benjamin. Mindfulness can help reintegrate the brain. And sometimes often with adolescents, we have a lack of integration between the lower brain and the upper brain. And mindfulness exercises help integrate those two parts of the brain and help kids step outside of the emotion, the very big emotions that they're feeling, and observe them from the outside, so
Right.
that they can figure out what to do with those emotions, rather than just feeling like they're completely overwhelmed and wash in that emotion. So I highly recommend reading, not Mindset, sorry.
Aware.
I'll look at it. Aware is one of them. Yeah, you'll get the basic idea from Aware, which is a book I just really enjoy.
Okay. And you said something there, though, that I think is so important, that we stress all the time to the fathers that we speak with, is that find what works for you, right? So often there's this idea of, I have to sit still for 5 complete minutes or 10 complete minutes, or if I'm working out, it needs to be an hour-long workout and it needs to be this way. Just starting and doing something has so many positive effects.
Yeah. But lately we've had to sit in today, for example, I've taken my kid to the orthodontist, and I'm not allowed to go in. I have to sit in the car in the parking lot. That'll be a moment for me to meditate. I try to forget my phone on a regular basis when I'm going into appointments and things like that, so that if I'm sitting somewhere, I have a chance to just sort of take some breaths and close my eyes, and get my tongue off the roof of my mouth and relax my jaw and stuff like that. And for me, as someone who suffers from anxiety, that's really important. I have to do that, or I'm a wreck. And especially as someone who sits at a table all the time typing, my job is to write a lot, and in order to do that, I have to sit, and so I end up hunched over all the time. So just remembering to sort of release that, that's all good. Yoga and things like that.
And I think so many times too, we don't even realize it, right? Until we take that mindful moment, we don't realize how jumbled and busy our minds were, that there's traffic and gridlock and it's a super highway going on there, that once we become aware, to borrow the title there of the book,
right,
it becomes like, oh, why am I not doing this more? Why haven't I been doing this?
Adults. And that's for adults. And when I talk about that integration thing, and by the way, the book is Mindsight. In Mindsight, where he goes into depth over this kid whose pseudonym is, I think, Benjamin, about his very specific lack of integration during adolescence, and how also substance abuse is, as Dan Siegel has said in a bunch of different interviews, is typified by a lack of integration. Often people with substance use disorder are just not dealing with an integrated brain at all. And so that's why mindfulness and yoga and things like that are pretty common in recovery centers, because it's and especially in places like rehab and detox and places like that, because it's just a time to start experiencing what it feels like to actually feel emotions and actually be able to identify them and set them aside and name them and all that sort of thing.
All right, I want to be mindful of your time because I do know that we are coming up on an hour and there's one more section I want to get to here. But I want to
Okay.
address sleep first because for me,
Yes.
this is the one I struggle with so much, and I am so aware. Last night I'm putting my son to bed. I fell asleep in his bed at around 8:30, 9 o'clock. I wake up at 11 o'clock, and now I'm wired for the entire night as I try and finish the book and take my notes, and I'm just excited about the next day. How do you get sleep consistently, and how do you get your children to get sleep consistently, especially when we're talking about those adolescents and how their brains are wired differently?
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know this, adolescents experience something called sleep phase delay, where melatonin and the other chemicals in your brain that sort of get you rested, that doesn't sort of get squirted out in the brain until later in the evening. And they want to wake up naturally later in the morning. And that's one reason that the research on delayed school start times is so important, and why the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that schools start no earlier than 8:30. That's all based on research. And not only does it help with depression, anxiety, attention, it also reduces the number of car crashes caused by adolescents, because adolescents not only have sleep phase delay, they have, just like, actually, this is true of alcohol too. They're less likely to feel the negative effects of their lack of sleep. They're less likely to feel like they're overtired, which can cause a lot of car accidents. Also, with drinking, adolescents, are less likely to feel as drunk as an adult would be with the same amount of alcohol in their system. So we prioritize sleep. I mean, that's just it, like, period. And we have, since the kids were really little. We've enforced a quiet time in the afternoon on weekends since the kids were really, really little. We call it nap time, but it's, reading, doing whatever, something quiet by yourself that, we've been doing since the kids were toddlers. And it's still to this day something that's really important to us. And so the other thing is we talk a lot about, so for example, if a kid wants to review for a test for an extra hour, they're like, man, I'm just not ready for this French test. I need one more hour. The truth is that an extra hour of sleep is more effective for memory consolidation than an extra hour of reviewing. So if your kid is worried about that test tomorrow, getting more sleep the night before instead of that extra hour of reviewing is actually a really powerful tool. So understanding that kids do have trouble going to sleep later, lobby your school board to follow the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations of school starting no later than 8:30. If the pandemic has done one thing, though, it has restored some sense of normalcy to kids' sleep. Kids in adolescence, especially, adolescents actually have higher sleep needs than some younger children. So now suddenly during the pandemic, kids are getting more sleep. They're getting a couple of hours more, at least an hour more sleep every night. And that's been fantastic because it is so important for brain development and memory consolidation.
I want to go on the flip side of that real quick, though, because I feel like so many kids have shifted and they are staying up later. Yes, they're not commuting, so they don't have to get up as early. But I feel like, my mother as an educator in the public school system would see that kids would log on at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
And they were sleeping.
Hello, my kids. Hello.
Yeah.
Yep, right here. Yeah. Nocturnal. My kids went nocturnal. However, when they went nocturnal, we still said, sorry, you still have to get up, because my son is in a hybrid situation where he still has to go to school 2 days a week. So if he stayed up all night, tough beans, you're still going to school. I'm not making any excuses for you. You're going to have to talk to your teachers about it. So it's really important that we let kids feel the logical consequences of their actions. And if the logical consequences are, that I'm falling asleep in second period, then that is a logical consequence that, when we help them see that that is the outflow of their sleep situation, talking about that stuff is really important.
So,
and modeling it too, also. Again, with the modeling, back to the modeling, model the sleep thing too.
I would love to. I'm trying. I promise I'm trying. Yeah. That is my flaw. I'm working on it. All right. I want to get to this because this is so important, right? We talked about the protections. We talked about all of the negative consequences for kids here. But how the heck do we talk about it with them? I think that can be the most challenging part for sometimes. I loved, as a chicken wing eater, I loved your hot ones example. I want to do that with my family. I want to do that with my sons when they can handle the heat. And I think it's just going to be so much fun.
So much fun.
How do you do it? How do you start these conversations?
So for anyone who doesn't understand what the hot ones thing means, you can read it. It's actually an excerpt in the Washington Post. There's a show called Hot Ones on the First We Feast network, and Sean Evans is a wonderful interviewer. And so what he does is he gets celebrities sort of off their game and sort of lowering their defenses by feeding them hot wings along with his questions. And so we did that with our kids. We had 10 hot wings, and all the way up to wings so hot that we had to drink liquefied vanilla ice cream in order to allay
Which sounds
the pain.
fantastic, by the way. Always a good idea.
It ended up being great. Yeah, all the milk in the house was gone, almond milk, all gone, and then vanilla ice cream is what we had. But the questions that we came up with were, 10 questions that were really about who they are as people. And it showed that we were really interested in who they are. And, the Partnership to End Awareness is really clear that kids who have family dinner with their family, the more often you have family dinner, the lower their risk of substance use disorder during their lifetime. Doesn't have to be family dinner, though. That can be emblematic of, car trips, anything, any regular interval where you can get past the how was school fine kind of conversation. This conversation has to start really, really young. In the book, I give scripts in order for you to start these conversations and move them up developmentally with your kids until they're in college. Because the truth is that even when they look away from us toward their peers for information, they still rely on us for reliable information around health and safety. So listening, one of the big things is that, yes, we do have to listen to them. We do have to listen even when it's about topics that we don't particularly care about. And we don't need to fix their problems for them. More often what kids tell me is, look, I do want to talk to my parents. I just don't want them to try to fix everything all the time. Sometimes I just need for them to hear me. So let them know that we hear them and we see them for who they are and not who we wish they were, and that we're listening.
And the scripts that you talk about, you have them there not just for talking to your kids, but ones that your kids can use when talking to their peers, which are so important. There's so many good pieces of advice in this book. I really did love it. And I was in tears at the end when you were talking about Jeremy and his parents and his hopes and fears. So I really can't recommend the book enough. Jess, we end all of our podcasts here, our live streams, because we are the Dad Habit. We look at small habits. What is one habit that you have in your life that is easy to implement but has a big impact for you?
Every single time I'm faced with that and right now it's really intense for me that I want to step in and just fix something for my kid or do something or end his frustration. Every single time I have to take a breath and say, excuse me, that this parenting thing, it's a long haul job, and it is not achieved in the small emergencies. It is achieved over the long haul. And if I focus more on the process of becoming than the end product of whatever that small emergency is, this homework assignment, this missed soccer game because the kid forgot his cleats. If I can focus on, do I want to fix it right now, or do I want my kid to be the kind of person who can handle it himself next time, then I'm usually going to do the right thing. So process over product, long-term over short-term. Do you want to fix it now, or do you want your kid to be more capable and competent in the future?
I love it. I love it so much. Jess Lahey, the book is The Addiction Inoculation. Thank you so much for taking so much time here today to expand on it and talk about it. It was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. Everybody out there listening, if you have any questions, please send them to us. Facebook, YouTube, tweet them at us. Like, follow, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Jess Lahey, thank you so much again. Check out her book, and we will talk to you next time on the Dad Hab Live. Appreciate you listening.